The plane touched down at the airport just after 2 in the afternoon, and Jerome couldn't wait to get home. 6 months in London had felt like 6 years. Sure, settling his grandmother's estate had been important work, but he missed his own bed, his own coffee maker, and most of all, the quiet comfort of his own space. As the taxi pulled through the gates of Willowbrook Estates, Jerome pressed his face to the window like a kid. Everything looked exactly the same. The perfect lawns, the matching streetlights, the fancy mailboxes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. This place had always felt a little too fancy for a guy who grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment, but his grandmother had left him the house, and he'd grown to love it. The driver helped him pull his bags from the trunk. Jerome tipped him $20 and watched the yellow cab disappear around the corner. For a moment, he just stood there breathing in the familiar air. October in his neighborhood always smelled like fallen leaves in someone's fireplace. Walking toward his house, Jerome noticed a few small changes. The community fountain had new flowers around it, bright orange mums that definitely weren't there when he left. There were some cars in driveways that he didn't recognize, but that was normal. People moved in and out of Willowbrook all the time, but as he got closer to his own house, something felt wrong. Really wrong. His front porch had furniture on it that he'd never seen before. A white wicker chair with flowery cushions, a matching table, and some kind of decorative wind chime that was making soft tinkling sounds in the breeze. Jerome stopped walking and stared. He definitely hadn't bought any of that stuff, and the windows. His living room windows had different curtains. Instead of the dark blue ones he remembered, there were cream-colored curtains with tiny pink flowers all over them, the kind of curtains his grandmother might have liked, but definitely not his style. Jerome pulled out his phone to call Mrs. Chen, his neighbor across the street who'd promised to keep an eye on the place. Maybe she'd done some redecorating as a welcome home surprise. It seemed unlikely, but he couldn't think of any other explanation. Before he could dial, he heard a voice behind him. "Excuse me. Hey, you there." Jerome turned around to see a woman marching toward him from the house next door. She looked like she was in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a white blouse so crisp it probably crackled when she walked. Most importantly, she was wearing some kind of official-looking badge that said, Willowbrook HOA board member. "Can I help you?" Jerome asked, trying to keep his voice friendly despite the woman's obviously hostile tone. "You most certainly can. Help me," the woman said, stopping right in front of him with her hands on her hips. "You can explain what you're doing on private property with those suitcases. This is a gated community, not some kind of hotel." Jerome blinked hard, wondering if jet lag was making him hallucinate. "I'm sorry, what?" "This is my house. I live here." The woman's eyes got narrow and cold. "Your house?" "I don't think so, young man. The owner of this property has been absent for months, and I would certainly know if he was returning today." "Well, he is returning today," Jerome said, forcing himself to stay calm. "Because I'm him. I'm Jerome, and this is my address. 847 Maple Ridge Lane." The woman crossed her arms and looked Jerome up and down in a way that made his skin crawl. It was the kind of look that said she'd already made up her mind about him before he'd even opened his mouth. "Listen, I don't know what kind of scam you're running here, but I'm Patricia Henderson, a member of the HOA board. I've been monitoring this property personally, and I can guarantee you that you don't belong here." Jerome felt his chest tighten. He'd lived in this neighborhood for 3 years, paid his taxes, shoveled his neighbors' driveways when it snowed, organized the annual block party. But this woman was looking at him like he was some kind of criminal. "Look, Patricia," Jerome said, trying to keep his voice level. "I understand you're trying to protect the neighborhood, and I appreciate that. But I really do live here. I can show you my driver's license if you want. Anyone can fake an ID these days," Patricia said with a dismissive wave. "What I want to know is how you got through the security gate. Did someone give you the access code? Because that would be a serious violation of our community guidelines." Jerome stared at her. "I have my own access code. I've lived here for 3 years." The real homeowner would have notified the HOA board before leaving for such an extended absence, Patricia continued as if Jerome hadn't spoken at all. "We have strict protocols about these things. We can't just have random people showing up and claiming to own property." That's when it hit Jerome like a punch to the gut. The way Patricia kept saying, the real homeowner, instead of just you. The way she was so determined not to believe him even though he had keys and ID. The way she kept emphasizing certain words like she was trying to make a point. Let me get this straight, Jerome said slowly. You're saying that because I'm black. I couldn't possibly be the owner of this house? Patricia's face went red. I never said anything about race. This is about property security and maintaining community standards. Right, Jerome said. He pulled his keys out of his pocket and held them up so Patricia could see them clearly. Well, these are the keys to my house. I'm going to use them to open my front door and go inside my home now. Patricia stepped sideways, putting herself directly between Jerome and his own front door. I don't think so. I'm responsible for this property right now, and I'm not letting some stranger just walk in. Responsible for my property? According to who? According to the HOA board. When a property appears abandoned, we have the authority to take protective measures to preserve neighborhood property values. Jerome's mouth fell open. Abandoned? I was gone for 6 months settling my grandmother's estate. I paid all my HOA fees in advance. I arranged for lawn care and mail forwarding. How is that abandonment? But Patricia wasn't listening anymore. She had pulled out her cell phone and was scrolling through her contacts with the kind of determined look that meant trouble. I'm calling the police, she announced loudly. We have a potential break-in situation here. A break-in? At my own house? With my own keys? Patricia looked up from her phone with a cold smile that made Jerome's blood run cold. That's what the police will determine. I'm sure they'll get this whole situation sorted out. Jerome felt his heart start racing. He looked around the neighborhood and realized that other residents had started coming out of their houses to see what was going on. Some looked concerned, others just curious. A few were even taking pictures with their phones. He spotted Mrs. Chen across the street and waved at her. Mrs. Chen, it's me, Jerome. Can you please tell this woman that I live here? Mrs. Chen started walking toward them, but Patricia held up her hand like a traffic cop. Ma'am, please stay back. This individual is trespassing, and the situation is under control. But that's Jerome, Mrs. Chen called out, looking confused. He lives in that house. I've been watering his plants like he asked. Patricia completely ignored her and pressed the call button on her phone. Jerome heard it ringing and felt a sick feeling in his stomach. This crazy woman was actually going to call the police on him for trying to go into his own house. Yes, I need police at 847 Maple Ridge Lane, Patricia said into the phone, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. I have a black male here with suitcases, claiming to have keys to a house that's been vacant for months. He's being very aggressive and refusing to leave the property when asked. Jerome pulled out his own phone and hit record. If this was really happening, if the police were really coming to his own house because this woman couldn't believe a black man lived in her fancy neighborhood, then he was going to document every single second of it. The phone was shaking slightly in his hands, but his voice was steady as he spoke into the camera. My name is Jerome Washington. Today is October 15th. I'm standing in front of my own house at 847 Maple Ridge Lane, and a neighbor has just called the police on me for trying to enter my own home. Jerome kept his phone steady, making sure to capture both Patricia's face and every word that came out of her mouth. His grandmother had always told him that the truth was the most powerful weapon anyone could have, and right now, he was collecting evidence of the biggest lie he'd ever witnessed. Yes, he's still here, Patricia was saying to the police dispatcher, her voice getting higher and more dramatic with each word. No, I don't feel safe. He seems very agitated and confrontational. I think he might be on something. Jerome almost laughed out loud at that. If anyone looked like they were on something, it was Patricia, whose face was now bright red and whose hands were shaking as she gripped her phone. Ma'am, Jerome said, making sure his voice was calm and clear for his recording. I'm not agitated, I'm confused. You're preventing me from entering my own home. Can you please explain what legal authority you have to do that? Patricia covered her phone with her hand and shot him a look that could have melted steel. I already told you. The HOA board has designated me as the temporary caretaker of this property due to abandonment. Show me the paperwork, Jerome said. I don't have to show you anything. Actually, you do. If you're claiming legal authority over my property, you need documentation. That's how the law works. Patricia's left eye started twitching, which Jerome took as a good sign. He was getting under her skin, which meant he was asking the right questions. More neighbors had come outside now, and Jerome recognized most of them. There was Mr. Thompson from 2 houses down, the retired teacher who always complimented Jerome on his garden, the young couple with the twins from the corner house, Mrs. Garcia, who made incredible tamales and always brought Jerome a plate during the holidays. Mrs. Chen had gotten closer despite Patricia's earlier warning to stay back. Jerome, honey, what's going on? I've been taking care of your house just like you asked me to. Patricia whirled around like she'd been slapped. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away. This man has obviously manipulated you into helping him with some kind of elaborate fraud scheme. Mrs. Chen's mouth dropped open so wide that Jerome worried her dentures might fall out. Fraud? Patricia, this is Jerome. He's lived here for 3 years. His grandmother left him this house. I watched him paint the entire kitchen last summer. That's impossible, Patricia said firmly. The homeowner would have notified the board before leaving for such an extended period. We have very clear rules about these things. Jerome felt his anger starting to build. What rules? I've read the HOA bylaws cover to cover. There's nothing that says I have to ask permission to travel. Extended absences require board notification, Patricia insisted. Define extended, Jerome challenged. Patricia hesitated for just a moment, then lifted her chin defiantly. More than 60 days. Show me where that's written. I don't have to show you anything. Jerome turned to address the growing crowd of neighbors. Everyone, I want you to hear this. I've been in London for 6 months, settling my grandmother's estate. Before I left, I notified the post office to hold my mail. I arranged for professional lawn care service. I asked Mrs. Chen to water my plants and check on the house weekly. I paid all my bills and HOA fees 6 months in advance. Can someone please tell me what I did wrong? Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his face creased with concern. Jerome, we all know you live here, son. Patricia, what's this really about? Patricia's face somehow managed to get even redder. This is about community, safety and property values. We can't just let anyone walk around claiming to own houses in our neighborhood. Anyone? Mrs. Garcia asked, her voice sharp as a knife. Patricia, what exactly do you mean by anyone? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Jerome could see understanding dawning on his neighbors' faces. They were starting to realize what Jerome had figured out from the very beginning. I mean strangers, Patricia said quickly. People who don't belong in a community like ours. But I do belong here, Jerome said quietly. I live here. I pay taxes here. I vote here. I help Mrs. Garcia carry her groceries when her arthritis is acting up. I organize the annual block party that everyone loves so much. What exactly do I have to do to belong? Patricia's phone call had ended, and she was now clutching her phone like it was the only thing keeping her from drowning. The police are on their way. They'll sort this whole mess out. Good, Jerome said. I hope they do. He turned back to his neighbors. I want everyone to see this. I want you all to witness what's happening here today. Several people were now recording with their phones, and Jerome was grateful for it. Whatever happened when the police arrived, there would be multiple witnesses and multiple angles of video. Patricia, Mrs. Chen said, her voice trembling with what Jerome realized was anger. I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. In all the years you've lived in this neighborhood, have you ever called the police on any of the white residents? That question is completely inappropriate, Patricia snapped. No, it's not, Mr. Thompson said. It's extremely relevant. Jerome, you said you were out of town for 6 months? Yes, sir. And Patricia, you said the house appeared to be abandoned? It did appear to be abandoned, yes. Mrs. Chen made a disgusted noise. That's ridiculous. I've been there every single week. The lawn was being maintained by a professional service. The newspapers weren't piling up because Jerome had them stopped. There were lights on timers in different rooms. How exactly does that look abandoned? Jerome was watching Patricia's face carefully. and he caught something that made his blood run cold. For just a split second, when Mrs. Chen mentioned the lights on timers, Patricia looked guilty. Not angry or defensive, but guilty. "Wait a minute," Jerome said slowly. "Patricia, how do you know so much about my house looking abandoned? Your house is next door, but you can't actually see my front door or driveway from any of your windows because of the hedge between our properties." Patricia opened and closed her mouth like a fish gasping for air. I walk by regularly. It's part of my HOA duties to monitor the neighborhood." "What HOA duties?" Mrs. Garcia asked. "I've been on the board for 3 years and we don't have any kind of neighborhood patrol responsibilities." "Well, I take initiative," Patricia said defensively. Jerome felt puzzle pieces starting to click together in his mind, and he didn't like the picture they were forming. "Patricia, you said you're responsible for my property right now. You said the HOA board designated you as temporary caretaker, but Mrs. Garcia is on the board, and she seems surprised by that information." Mrs. Garcia nodded vigorously. "We've never designated temporary caretakers for any property. The HOA doesn't have that kind of authority. But I have been monitoring the property," Patricia said quickly, sweat starting to bead on her forehead. "Someone needed to make sure it stayed secure." "Monitoring it how?" Jerome asked. Patricia's face went from red to pale in about 2 seconds. "Just making sure no one was breaking in or anything." Jerome's stomach dropped. "Patricia, have you been inside my house?" The silence that followed was so complete that Jerome could hear his own heartbeat. Every neighbor was staring at Patricia, waiting for her answer. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. "I may have checked inside once or twice," Patricia said in a voice barely above a whisper, "just to make sure everything was secure." "With what key?" Jerome demanded. There's a spare key, hidden by the back door." Jerome felt like someone had punched him in the chest. There was a spare key hidden by the back door, but only 4 people in the world knew about it. Himself, Mrs. Chen, his ex-girlfriend who'd moved to California 2 years ago, and his cousin who lived in Atlanta. "How did you know about the spare key?" Jerome asked, his voice deadly quiet. Patricia's mouth moved, but no sound came out. She was trapped and everyone could see it. In the distance, Jerome could hear sirens getting closer. The police would be here any minute, and Jerome realized that this situation was about to get much more complicated. But at least now he had witnesses. At least now his neighbors could see exactly who Patricia really was. The sirens got louder, and Jerome took a deep breath, preparing himself for whatever came next. One thing was certain: this was far from over. 2 police cars pulled up to the curb with their red and blue lights flashing, casting strange shadows across the perfectly manicured neighborhood. Jerome felt his chest tighten as he watched 4 officers get out of their vehicles. He'd run through this scenario in his head 1,000 times. Keep your hands visible, speak clearly, don't make any sudden movements, stay calm no matter what happens. The lead officer was a tall black woman with sergeant stripes on her uniform. Her nameplate read Williams. Jerome felt a tiny bit of relief, though he knew better than to assume anything based on that alone. "I'm Sergeant Williams," she said, walking up to the group with her partner close behind. "We got a call about a possible break-in attempt." Patricia immediately stepped forward, transforming from the sweating, panicked woman she'd been moments before into the picture of concerned citizenship. "Yes, officer, thank you so much for coming quickly." This man showed up with suitcases, claiming to live here, but this house has been vacant for months. I was concerned about neighborhood safety. Sergeant Williams nodded and turned to Jerome. "Sir, can you show me some identification?" Jerome slowly reached into his jacket pocket, very aware that all 4 officers were watching his every movement. "Yes, ma'am, here's my driver's license." He handed over his ID, which clearly showed his name and address. Jerome Washington, 847 Maple Ridge Lane. The sergeant examined the license carefully, looking back and forth between the photo and Jerome's face, then checking the address against the house they were standing in front of. "This ID shows this address," she said. "IDs can be fake these days." Patricia jumped in quickly. And even if it's real, that doesn't prove he actually lives there currently. Ma'am, Sergeant Williams said firmly, I need you to step back and let me conduct this investigation. She turned back to Jerome. Sir, you're saying this is your residence? Yes, ma'am. I've been in London for 6 months settling my grandmother's estate. I just flew back this afternoon. Jerome kept his voice respectful but confident. I have keys to the house and several of my neighbors can vouch for me. Mrs. Chen stepped forward. Officer, I'm Helen Chen. I live across the street. This is definitely Jerome. And he absolutely lives in that house. I've been watering his plants and checking on the property while he was away, just like he asked me to. Mr. Thompson nodded. I can confirm that as well, officer. Jerome's been my neighbor for 3 years. Good man, very responsible homeowner. Sergeant Williams looked back at Patricia. Ma'am, you're the one who called this in as a break-in attempt. Do you have any evidence that this man doesn't live here? Patricia's confident mask was starting to slip again. Well, the house has been empty for months. Nobody was living there. Being away for 6 months doesn't mean someone doesn't live somewhere, the sergeant said patiently. Ma'am, what's your relationship to this property? I'm Patricia Henderson, HOA board member. I've been designated as the temporary caretaker of this property due to abandonment issues. Mrs. Garcia stepped forward from the crowd. Officer, I need to clarify something important. I'm actually on the HOA board and we have never designated anyone as a temporary caretaker for any property. We don't have that authority. Sergeant Williams' eyebrows went up. Is that so? She looked back at Patricia, whose face had gone pale again. There may have been some miscommunication, Patricia said weakly. Sir, the sergeant said to Jerome, you mentioned you have keys to this property? Jerome held up his keyring. Yes, ma'am. Would you mind demonstrating that they work? Not at all. Jerome walked to his front door, inserted his house key, and turned it. The door opened smoothly. Wait, Patricia said desperately. Locks can be changed. That doesn't prove anything. Sergeant Williams was clearly losing patience with Patricia. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to explain exactly what authority you think you have over this property. Jerome had an idea. Officer, if I may suggest something, I have a security system inside with cameras. We could check the footage to see what's been happening while I was away. Patricia's face went white as a sheet. That's really not necessary. Actually, that's an excellent idea, Sergeant Williams said. Sir, would you mind if we took a look? Of course, officer. Please come in. Jerome opened his front door wider and gestured for the officers to enter first. As they walked into the house, Jerome immediately saw things that made his worst fears come true. His living room had been completely rearranged. His own furniture was pushed against the walls like it was in storage, and there was completely different furniture in the center of the room. A floral couch that definitely wasn't his, a glass coffee table he'd never seen before, and decorative pillows that looked like something from a flower shop. Officer, Jerome said, his voice tight with controlled anger, this furniture isn't mine. Maybe you forgot what you had, Patricia said from behind them, but her voice sounded hollow. Ma'am, Sergeant Williams said, looking around the room with a trained eye. It appears that someone has been living in this house. Jerome led them to the hallway closet where he kept his security equipment. The system was still there, but someone had definitely been messing with it. Someone tried to disable it, Jerome said, but they didn't know about the backup recording system. He pulled out his phone and opened the security app. Even from London, he'd been able to check on his house remotely, though he hadn't looked at it much while dealing with his grandmother's affairs. Let me scroll back to see what happened, Jerome said, his fingers moving across the screen. Here, this is from 2 weeks ago. On the phone screen, crystal clear video showed Patricia entering the house through the back door, carrying suitcases and shopping bags. Over the next several days, the cameras captured her bringing in furniture, hanging new curtains, and obviously making herself completely at home. Ma'am, Sergeant Williams said to Patricia, her voice now very serious. Can you explain why you're on this security footage moving into someone else's house? Patricia was backing toward the door like a cornered animal. I was maintaining the property. Someone had to keep it secure. By moving in your own furniture? The sergeant asked. I was trying to make it look lived in for security purposes. One of the other officers, a young Hispanic man whose nameplate read Martinez, spoke up. Ma'am, what you're describing is unlawful entry and unlawful occupancy. Those are felony charges. Jerome kept scrolling through the footage. Officer, look at this from 5 days ago. The video showed Patricia hosting what looked like a dinner party in Jerome's living room, with several other women sitting around her coffee table with wine glasses and papers spread in front of them. Ma'am, Sergeant Williams said, it appears you've been not only living in this house without permission, but entertaining guests as well. Patricia was now clearly in full panic mode. You don't understand, the house was sitting empty. Someone had to take responsibility. Taking responsibility doesn't mean moving in, Officer Martinez said. Sir, he turned to Jerome, have you given this woman permission to enter your house or use your property in any way? Absolutely not, Jerome said firmly. I'd barely spoken to her before today. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway. Officer, I need to tell you something. About 3 weeks ago, Patricia started asking me detailed questions about Jerome. When he was coming back, what his travel schedule was like, whether he had family visiting regularly. Jerome felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of questions? She wanted to know if you'd given me a specific return date. She also asked about your job, how often you traveled for work, and how you could afford a house in this neighborhood. Mrs. Chen looked ashamed. At the time, I thought she was just being a curious neighbor, but now I realize she was planning something. Sergeant Williams was taking detailed notes. Ma'am, she said to Patricia, it sounds like this may have been premeditated. That would make these charges much more serious. Patricia looked around the room like she was searching for an escape route that didn't exist. This is all just a big misunderstanding. I was trying to help the community. By committing breaking and entering? Officer Martinez asked. Jerome watched the scene unfold with a mixture of vindication and disbelief. He was standing in his own house with police officers proving that he lived there, while a woman who had illegally moved into his home was still trying to convince everyone that he was the problem. But for the first time since this nightmare started, Jerome felt like the truth was finally winning. As the officers continued their investigation of Jerome's house, the full scope of Patricia's deception became impossible to ignore. In the kitchen, Officer Martinez found mail addressed to Patricia that had been delivered to Jerome's address. In the master bedroom, Patricia's clothes were hanging in Jerome's closet right next to his own clothes, and her personal belongings were scattered across his dresser like she'd been living there for months. Ma'am, Sergeant Williams said to Patricia, this goes far beyond just checking on someone's property. You've completely moved into this house. Patricia was now visibly shaking, her hands trembling as she tried to maintain what was left of her story. I can explain everything. You see, when properties are left vacant for long periods, they become targets for real criminals. I was protecting the entire neighborhood by maintaining a presence here. Officer Martinez looked up from a stack of mail he was examining. Ma'am, you've been having your mail delivered to this address. You've also changed your address with several utility companies to this location. Jerome's mouth fell open in shock. You changed your address to my house? It was temporary, Patricia protested, her voice cracking. I was between residences and the house was just sitting empty anyway. Between residences? Sergeant Williams asked, her pen poised over her notepad. What happened to your previous residence? Patricia's face crumpled like a house of cards in a strong wind. There were some financial difficulties. The bank, they foreclosed on my house 6 weeks ago. The truth hit Jerome like a physical blow. So you lost your house and decided to just move into mine? I was going to contact you when you got back, Patricia said desperately. I thought maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement. You travel so much for your job and the house was just sitting here empty most of the time anyway. Work out an arrangement? Jerome's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. You broke into my house, moved in your furniture, changed your mailing address, hosted dinner parties, and called the police on me when I came home. What exactly did you think we were going to work out? Mrs. Chen appeared in the bedroom doorway, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Patricia, I need to ask you something. 3 weeks ago, when you asked me for Jerome's spare key, you said the HOA board needed access to check for water damage. Was any of that true? Jerome spun around. You gave her my spare key? Mrs. Chen looked mortified. She had that official board member badge and she knew all the right terminology. She made it sound like there had been reports of a leak and they needed to inspect the property for insurance purposes. Sergeant Williams was writing furiously. So you obtained the key under false pretenses. Ma'am, that's fraud in addition to the breaking and entering charges. Patricia seemed to realize that every word coming out of her mouth was digging her deeper into legal trouble. Look, maybe I made some poor decisions, but my heart was in the right place. I was trying to help. Help? Who? Officer Martinez asked pointedly. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you were helping yourself to someone else's property. Jerome was still scrolling through security footage on his phone, and what he found next made his blood boil. Officer, you need to see this. Look at this video from 8 days ago. The footage showed Patricia giving what appeared to be a guided tour of Jerome's house to 2 other women. She was gesturing around the living room and kitchen like she was showing off her own home, even opening cabinets and closets to display Jerome's belongings. She's been showing people around my house like she owns it, Jerome said, his voice tight with fury. One of the women in the video looked familiar to Mrs. Garcia, who had followed them inside. That's Linda Morrison from the HOA board. Patricia, what did you tell Linda about this house? Patricia was now backed into a literal corner, her back against Jerome's bedroom wall. I may have mentioned that I was house-sitting for the owner while he was traveling. House-sitting? Jerome laughed. Bitterly. You moved in your own furniture, changed your address, hosted parties, and gave tours. That's not house-sitting, that's identity theft. Sergeant Williams closed her notepad with a snap. Ma'am, I've heard enough. You need to gather whatever belongings are yours and come with us. You're under arrest for breaking and entering unlawful occupancy, mail fraud, and filing a false police report. A false police report? Patricia asked, as if this was the first she'd heard of such a thing. You called us claiming this man was attempting to break into a house when you knew perfectly well that he was the legitimate owner trying to enter his own home, the sergeant explained. That's filing a false report, and it's a serious crime. As Officer Martinez began reading Patricia her rights, more neighbors had gathered outside Jerome's house. Jerome could see them through the bedroom window, and many of them looked shocked and embarrassed. Mr. Thompson approached Sergeant Williams. Officer, I owe Jerome a huge apology. We all knew he lived here, but when Patricia started talking about official HOA procedures and temporary caretaking arrangements, some of us thought maybe there was some legitimate explanation. She was very convincing, Mrs. Garcia added sadly. She knew all the right legal terms and seemed to have genuine authority. But we should have questioned it more when Jerome showed up with keys and identification. Jerome felt a complicated mix of emotions. These were his neighbors, people he'd lived next to for 3 years, and some of them had been willing to believe a complete stranger over him. What bothers me most, Jerome said to the group, is that Patricia's first instinct was to assume I couldn't be the homeowner. Even when I had keys, even when I had ID, even when Mrs. Chen vouched for me, she was absolutely determined to believe I was lying. Mrs. Chen nodded sadly. Jerome, I'm so sorry. When she first started asking questions about you weeks ago, I should have been more suspicious. She wanted to know so much about your background, your work, your family situation. What kind of questions? Sergeant Williams asked. She asked how Jerome could afford a house in this neighborhood. She wanted to know if he had a criminal record. She even asked if I thought he was really the kind of person who belonged in a community like Willowbrook Estates. Mrs. Chen's voice was thick with shame. At the time, I just told her Jerome was a wonderful neighbor and that was the end of it, but I should have realized what she was really asking. Jerome felt his anger rising again. She was profiling me. She was trying to find reasons why I didn't belong here. Officer Martinez had finished handcuffing Patricia and was leading her toward the door. Ma'am, you'll need to arrange for someone to remove your belongings from this property. You will not be allowed to return here under any circumstances. This is all just a huge mistake, Patricia said as they escorted her past Jerome. I was trying to help the community. You'll see, now that this house is unattended again, there will be real break-ins. Jerome stared at her in amazement. Even while being arrested in his own home, she was still trying to justify her actions and imply that he was somehow irresponsible for traveling. After the police cars left with Patricia, Jerome found himself standing in his living room surrounded by his neighbors. The room was still full of Patricia's furniture, making his own home feel foreign and violated. We need to have a serious conversation about what happened here today, Mrs. Garcia said quietly. As HOA board members, we need to figure out how Patricia was able to use her position to deceive people. More than that, Mr. Thompson said, we need to talk about why some of us were so ready to believe that Jerome didn't belong here, even when he had clear proof that he did. Jerome appreciated their honesty, but he was exhausted. Right now, I just want to get my house back to normal, but yes, we definitely need to have that conversation. Mrs. Chen handed him an envelope. Jerome, this is your mail from the post office, and I cannot tell you how sorry I am about the spare key. I feel terrible. It's not your fault, Jerome said, though part of him wondered how different things might have been if Mrs. Chen had been more suspicious of Patricia's requests. As his neighbors slowly filtered out, Jerome was left alone in his house for the first time in 6 months, but it didn't feel like his house anymore. Patricia had violated his space so completely that he felt like a stranger in his own home. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of everything for his insurance company and his lawyer. Because while Patricia was now in custody, Jerome suspected this nightmare was far from over. 4 weeks later, Jerome sat in his lawyer's office downtown, reviewing the stack of legal documents that had grown thicker every day since Patricia's arrest. His attorney, Rebecca Torres, was one of the best property law experts in the city, and she'd been working around the clock to make sure Patricia faced consequences for what she'd done. She took the plea deal, Rebecca said, sliding the final paperwork across her desk. 24 months in prison, 3 years probation, and full restitution for all damages to your property. She also has to pay for the cost of removing and storing all her belongings. Jerome nodded, feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. What about the civil lawsuit? Her insurance company agreed to settle for $200,000. Between that and the criminal restitution, you'll be more than compensated for what she put you through. Rebecca leaned back in her chair. Jerome, I have to tell you, in 20 years of practice, I've never seen a case quite like this one. What do you mean? The level of planning involved. Patricia didn't just stumble into your house and decide to stay. She researched your travel patterns, manipulated your neighbors for information, obtained your spare key through fraud, and then created an entire false narrative about HOA authority to justify her presence. This was sophisticated criminal behavior. Jerome had been thinking about that a lot over the past month. What I still don't understand is why she called the police when I came home. If she was trying to establish some kind of legal claim to the property, calling the cops on the actual owner seems like the worst possible strategy. Rebecca smiled grimly. That's where her racism became her downfall. She was so convinced that the police would side with her over you that she thought the call would actually strengthen her position. She believed that your word wouldn't matter as much as hers. Instead, it created a permanent record of her lies and gave us all the evidence we needed. Exactly. If she'd just tried to convince you to let her stay, or even disappeared before you got home, this might have been much harder to prove. Jerome's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Mrs. Chen, letting him know that the community meeting was starting in an hour. After everything that had happened, the HOA board had organized a neighborhood discussion about bias, inclusion, and preventing similar incidents in the future. Are you going to the meeting tonight? Rebecca asked. Yeah, I think so. Part of me just wants to move on and forget this whole thing ever happened, but another part of me thinks I owe it to the community to help make sure this doesn't happen to someone else. What does your gut tell you? Jerome thought about it. My gut tells me that Patricia didn't just appear out of nowhere with these attitudes. If she felt comfortable doing what she did, there might be other people in the neighborhood who think the same way but just haven't acted on it yet. The community center at Willowbrook Estates was packed when Jerome arrived that evening. He'd expected maybe 20 or 30 people, but it looked like nearly every household in the neighborhood was represented. People were sitting in folding chairs, standing along the walls, and even gathering in the hallway outside. Mrs. Garcia, who was leading the meeting as HOA president, stood up at the front of the room. "Thank you all for coming tonight. I think we can all agree that what happened to Jerome was completely unacceptable, and we need to make sure nothing like this ever happens again." Jerome had been asked to speak first, to tell his side of the story for those who hadn't witnessed it firsthand. As he walked to the front of the room, he saw faces he recognized, some supportive, some curious, and a few that looked distinctly uncomfortable. "4 weeks ago," Jerome began, "I came home from a 6-month trip to find that a neighbor had been living in my house, had convinced people she had authority over my property, and then called the police on me when I tried to enter my own home with my own keys." He told the whole story, from Patricia's initial confrontation to her arrest in his bedroom. The room was completely silent except for a few gasps when he described finding Patricia's belongings mixed in with his own. "But what I want to talk about tonight isn't just what Patricia did," Jerome continued. "I want to talk about how she was able to do it. She couldn't have pulled this off without some people being willing to believe that I didn't belong here, even when I had proof that I did." An older man Jerome didn't recognize raised his hand. "Are you saying we're all racists?" "No," Jerome said calmly. "I'm saying that Patricia was counting on certain assumptions people might make, and those assumptions made her plan possible. When she told people that the real homeowner wouldn't have left without notifying the board, some folks were willing to believe that I wasn't the real homeowner." Mrs. Chen stood up. "Jerome's right. I need to admit something to everyone here. When Patricia first started asking me questions about Jerome, some of her questions made me uncomfortable. She wanted to know how he could afford to live here, whether he was really a good fit for the neighborhood. I should have shut down those conversations, but I didn't." Mr. Thompson nodded. "I think a lot of us heard Patricia making comments over the past few months, and we didn't speak up because we didn't want to cause trouble. But our silence enabled her." A younger woman Jerome didn't know very well raised her hand. "What kinds of comments?" "She questioned whether Jerome traveled too much to be a responsible homeowner," Mrs. Garcia said. "She suggested that his work schedule was somehow suspicious. She even asked whether the HOA board should look into his background more thoroughly." Jerome felt his chest tighten. Patricia had been working on this for months, planting seeds of doubt about him with his own neighbors. "The thing is," Jerome said, "none of you would have thought twice about a white neighbor traveling for 6 months on business. None of you would have questioned whether they belonged here or suggested that the HOA investigate their background. Patricia knew that, and she used it." The uncomfortable shifting in the room told Jerome that his words were hitting home. A woman from the back of the room spoke up. "So what do we do now? How do we make sure this doesn't happen again?" Mrs. Garcia consulted her notes. "The board has already implemented several new policies. Any board member claiming authority over someone else's property must provide written documentation. We're requiring background checks for all board positions. And we're creating a clear process for residents to appeal any HOA actions they think are unfair." "That's a good start," Jerome said. "But I think we need to go deeper than policy changes. We need to talk honestly about the assumptions we make about each other." Over the next 2 hours, the conversation that followed was sometimes awkward, sometimes heated, but ultimately productive. People shared stories about times they'd made assumptions about neighbors based on race, age, or economic status. Others talked about feeling like they had to prove they belonged in the community. By the end of the meeting, the neighborhood had committed to quarterly diversity and inclusion discussions, a mentorship program to welcome new residents, and a community watch program focused on actual safety rather than profiling. As people were leaving, a young black couple approached Jerome. "Hi, we're Kevin and Lisa. We just moved in last week." Jerome smiled. "Welcome to the neighborhood. How are you settling in?" "Actually, we were worried about moving here after we heard about what happened to you," Lisa said. "But after tonight's meeting, we feel a lot more hopeful." Kevin nodded. "It seems like people are really committed to making changes." "They are," Jerome said. And you should know that you have neighbors who will have your back. Don't let one bad person make you feel like you don't belong here. As Jerome walked home that night, he reflected on how much had changed in just a month. Patricia was facing serious criminal charges and would likely spend the next 2 years in prison. His house was back to normal, with new locks and an upgraded security system. Most importantly, his community was having conversations about bias and inclusion that were long overdue. Jerome's phone buzzed with a text from his boss. "Saw the news coverage of your community meeting tonight. Proud of how you're handling this situation. Leadership material." Jerome smiled as he unlocked his front door. The house felt like home again, but more than that, the neighborhood felt different too. More honest, more open, more committed to being the kind of place where everyone truly belonged. As he turned off the lights and headed upstairs, Jerome realized that while Patricia had tried to make him feel like he didn't belong, she'd actually ended up strengthening his connection to the community, the neighbors who'd stood up for him, the difficult conversations they'd all committed to having, the changes they were making together. It all made Willowbrook Estates feel more like home than it ever had before. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its usual quiet evening routine. But it was a different place now, more aware, more inclusive, and more committed to making sure that what happened to Jerome would never happen to anyone else. And Jerome was home, surrounded by a community that had proven they would fight for him when it mattered most.